If one day the door of time were to open before your eyes and you stepped straight into medieval Europe, a world without Wi-Fi, without clean water, and where even the idea of hygiene was considered sinful, how long would you survive? Welcome to Advice for Time Traveling to Medieval Europe and More, the only handbook you'll ever need, unless you'd prefer to become the next historical corpse. Here, the water is filthier than beer, doctors believe Mars causes illness, and a single misplaced word could see you burned alive in the town square. Yet behind that curtain of mud and coal smoke lies a world both brutal and mesmerizing, where legends, queens and warriors wove the grand tragedies of humankind. So fasten the seatbelt of your mind, for this journey isn't just a trip through time, it's a confrontation with stench, blood, and belief, a passage through the darkest centuries, where survival is not for the faint of heart, and where you'll soon discover that the past has never truly slept. And if you truly dare to step through that door, leaving behind your modern comforts of hand sanitizer, moisturizers, and air conditioning, then prepare yourself. Because what awaits you on the other side is not the romantic glow of knights and princesses from fairy tales, but the smell of mud, smoke, and humanity itself. That unmistakable scent of an age where cleanliness was suspicious. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a world not made for the clean. Here, among cold stone walls and muddy streets, the very idea of personal hygiene was almost a luxury. Medieval people believed that bathing too often opened the door for demons to slip into the body through the pores. So, submerging yourself in water wasn't just considered odd. It could even be seen as heretical. They feared dirty water, but feared even more being seen as different. And in a world where difference meant danger, smelling authentically historical was your first survival skill. The rivers winding around towns were not meant for sightseeing or drinking. They were where people washed their clothes, dumped their waste, bathed their horses, and sometimes where corpses drifted downstream after an outbreak of plague. So, if you're a time traveler, your first rule is simple. Don't drink the water. Drink beer instead. It's safer, at least for most of Europe's history. Imagine waking up in a wooden house with a thatched roof, no glass windows, no chimney, where the smoke from the hearth seeps straight into the rafters. Everything in that room carries a scent: smoke, damp wood, human sweat, and time itself. Outside, church bells echo through the morning mist, blending with the creak of wooden wheels over mud, the cries of vendors, and somewhere, the neighing of horses mingling with whispered prayers. That is the symphony of the Middle Ages, alive, rough, heavy with smell and with life. Medieval people did not hate beauty. They simply understood it differently. A body that smelled sweet and clean was suspicious. It hinted at vanity and sin. Meanwhile, someone cloaked in linen stained with mud and sweat was seen as humble and devout. The upper classes might bathe, but only on special occasions, often in wooden tubs filled with rosewater, a luxury reserved for nobility. As for the common folk, they trusted that God would cleanse their souls. There was no need to waste water on the flesh. And so the world smelled. Strong, pungent, but terrifyingly real. It was the scent of survival, of humanity untouched by plastic or perfume. Every breath reminded you that we have evolved not only in thought, but in scent. In that world, a modern traveler would quickly realize just how different they are. Your pristine white cotton shirt would turn grey after a single trip to the market. Your mint-shampooed hair would grow oily within hours, and any perfume you brought would be buried under layers of smoke and sweat. You'd learn that to survive here, you don't need to shine. You just need to blend in with the smell. The filth of the Middle Ages wasn't merely physical, it was symbolic. It represented a worldview shaped by faith and fear. A time when religion ruled every thought, when the soul mattered far more than the body, and any attempt to purify the flesh was met with suspicion. The body was temporary, the soul eternal, and suffering was the path to salvation. So if your body stank, it meant you were closer to God. That world stands in sharp contrast to ours, where clean water flows from the tap, and a single stain can make us uneasy. Yet it is precisely this contrast that makes time travel so fascinating. Because when you step into the Middle Ages, you're not just exploring another civilization, you're confronting your own limits. How much filth can you endure and still call it survival? And the irony is, amid all that stench, life went on with a strange rhythm. People still laughed, loved, sang under the moonlight, held fairs and weddings. Candles flickering through the haze still illuminated simple dreams. A piece of bread, a sip of ale, someone waiting at home, dirty yet alive, filthy yet full of humanity. The Middle Ages weren't beautiful in a clean way. They were beautiful in their honesty. No filters, no false light, only small human beings struggling to exist in a harsh reality. And from that struggle came the virtues we still admire centuries later: faith, endurance, and resilience. Look closely, and you'll see, beneath the mud and tangled beards, beneath the stench and the coughs, people not so different from us. They feared disease, longed for life, loved and envied, dreamed of a better world. The only difference was that instead of seeking safety in cleanliness, they found it in faith. A world not made for the clean is more than just a warning for time travelers. It's a metaphor for modern life itself, because sometimes, in trying to scrub away every trace of dirt, we forget that being human means being a little wild, rough, and imperfect. Perhaps it's that very dirt, the smell of earth, sweat, and fear, that makes us truly alive. So if you ever get the chance to step into the Middle Ages, don't just pinch your nose. Breathe deeply, inhale that smoky, straw-scented air, and know that you are standing inside history. Not the polished history of books, but the living, breathing, smelling one. Because sometimes, to understand an era, you don't need to read another chronicle. You just need to stand in a medieval market, smell the smoke, hear the bells, and realize the world wasn't clean, but it was alive. And in that pungent rhythm of life, you'll learn something far more important. Cleanliness is the privilege of the modern, but survival was the art of the medieval. That world was not for the faint of heart. But if you dare to stay long enough to get used to the smell, you'll find beneath that crust of dirt lies the very soul of humanity, rough, conflicted, yet strangely radiant. That is the Middle Ages. And you, the lost traveller, have just stepped into its beating heart. And then, when you've grown accustomed to the smell of the Middle Ages, to the coal smoke, the sweat, the grime that has become your companion, another question begins to rise. In a world where the water was filthier than the mud, how did people survive? The answer comes in the form of a golden, frothy, fragrant, and deeply ironic liquid: beer. Welcome to drinking beer instead of water, the wet truth of the Middle Ages. If you think beer is merely a drink for merriment in a tavern, the Middle Ages will make you rethink everything, because here, beer was not just pleasure, it was life itself. In a world where rivers were dumping grounds, laundry sites, horse baths, and sometimes graveyards after plague outbreaks, clean water was almost a fantasy. People knew that water could make them sick, though they didn't know why. They only knew this: drinking water was a gamble with death, while drinking beer was not. And so, all of Europe became drunk on barley, not for joy, but for survival. It's hard to imagine an age where even children drank beer every day, but it's true. Small beer, a light brew with just enough alcohol to kill bacteria, was so common that it appeared at every meal, from peasants to nobles. Mothers would cradle their babies with one arm and hold a mug of weak ale with the other. Miners, blacksmiths, and mercenaries began each morning with a sip of beer instead of water. To them, beer was water, and water was danger. The tavern became the beating heart of every village, not merely a place to drink, but a place to live, listen, speak, and survive. Amid the scent of smoke and burning wood, people exchanged news, told stories, and plotted schemes. A knight might sit beside a merchant. A priest might share a table with a thief, all bound together by the bond of beer. In a way, beer was Europe's first social glue. But don't imagine that everyone was stumbling drunk. In truth, most medieval beer was quite weak, brewed multiple times with boiled water to stretch supplies. It was strong enough to warm the body and purify the liquid, but not enough to make one real. Beer in those days wasn't a passion. It was a survival strategy, born of desperation. Picture a day in the 14th century. At dawn, a farmer rises, takes up his hoe, and carries a wooden flask of thin ale. At noon, he sits beneath a tree, pouring a golden sip while wiping the sweat from his brow. By evening, he stops at the tavern, not to celebrate, but to hear the news. New taxes, wars, the plague creeping closer, and as night falls, by the flicker of candlelight glinting off sticky tables, they laugh, sing, and forget, if only for a moment, the fear of tomorrow. In that haze of hops, even suffering dissolved into foam, beer not only saved them from disease, it helped them endure reality. In an age of plague, war, and famine, people needed something to remind them they were still alive. Beer, with its bittersweet taste, became the emotional medicine of its time. Without it, the medieval night might have been unbearably silent. It's almost poetic that while we drink beer today for fun, medieval people drank it as a ritual of survival. In every village, brewing was a sacred craft. The women of the household were often its guardians, passing recipes from mother to daughter, generation to generation, like a family heirloom. Copper cauldrons, dried barley sheaves, and precious yeast sacks were treasured, for one small mistake could ruin an entire batch. And that meant the family might have nothing safe to drink for weeks. So each sip of medieval beer carried not just flavour, but safety, labour, and faith. It was humanity's instinctive triumph over nature, a primitive science of boiling and fermenting, centuries before Pasteur was even born. Without knowing why, they had already discovered sterilisation through survival. From that necessity, the tavern culture was born, a place where laughter mingled with oaths, prayers with curses. In cramped rooms thick with smoke and breath, calloused hands clinked mugs together, and class boundaries melted away. A peasant could throw an arm around a knight. A friar might listen to a barmaid's flirting. The tavern was the one place where medieval people were equals. Not before the law, but before the ale. And yet, it was also the cradle of conspiracy and chaos. Peasant revolts, palace intrigues, even whispers of heresy or plague. Many began over a shared jug of beer. While the church preached of sin, the tavern allowed people to be human, weak, hungry, curious, rebellious. Perhaps that's why the clergy always eyed beer with suspicion, though they drank plenty of it themselves. The more you think about it, the stranger it seems. A humble drink so deeply entwined with the story of humankind. Without beer, many towns might not have survived. Without taverns, rebellion might never have found its voice. And without the comfort of intoxication, humanity might have surrendered to despair. Beer was more than water. It was the liquid memory of civilization, flowing through the centuries, carrying the scent of sweat, ash, and fragile hope. Today, as we raise our glasses in brightly lit bars, few remember that our ancestors drank beer simply to stay alive. But if you ever travel back to the Middle Ages, remember this. Every sip you take isn't just to quench your thirst. It's to connect with an entire civilization that learned to survive in filth by turning it into something they could swallow. For in the darkness of history, when water killed and beer saved, humanity chose to drink to life. Drinking beer instead of water. It sounds like a joke, yet it's one of the most tragic and triumphant chapters in the story of survival. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, humankind found ways to adapt through creativity, instinct, and a touch of intoxicated courage. And perhaps because of that, the world still stands today. So the next time your beer touches your lips, don't just taste the bitterness. Imagine tasting the past, the thirst of souls long gone, the sweat and hope of those who lived without clean water, yet still found reasons to smile. Because in the end, the true miracle of beer was never the drunkenness. It was life itself. And then, after nights of beer, laughter, and candle smoke, when the haze of drunkenness faded, the people of the Middle Ages awoke once more into a world bound by fear and obedience. They could drink to forget the filth, the hunger, and the nearness of death. But they could never escape another, more invisible power. Faith. A faith so deep that men were willing to shed blood to defend it, and one that, in turn, caused more blood to flow than any weapon ever could. Welcome to the Church, the razor, and the blood. The age of blind faith. The Middle Ages were not only an era of rust and famine, they were an age of absolute belief. There, people trusted God more than they trusted themselves. They believed that every illness was a punishment, every death was ordained, and every drop of blood spilled, whether on a battlefield or beneath a barber's blade, carried sacred meaning. But faith, when twisted by fear and power, becomes a double-edged sword, one that saves and one that destroys. Imagine you're an ordinary villager living in the 14th century. Each morning the church bells ring, not only calling you to pray, but reminding you that you are being watched, not by men, but by God, and by those who speak in his name. The church is not just a refuge for the soul, it is the center of power, the place that decides who may live, who is cursed, and who shall burn in the square for speaking a single wrong word. The people of the Middle Ages had no doctors as we know them. They had priests, healers, and barbers. Strange, isn't it? Yet it's true. Those who shaved beards also performed surgery, extracted teeth, and sometimes acted as executioners. Their razors didn't just cut hair, they sliced open veins to purge the body of toxins. People believed all illness came from an imbalance among the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and the only way to heal was to let the blood flow. The more blood spilled, the closer one came to salvation. Cold rooms, the scent of rust and fresh blood mingling together. A patient lies trembling on a wooden table, whispering prayers as the razor flashes across his wrist. A priest stands nearby, chanting absolution for the departing soul. No one panics, for they all believe this is God's will. In that world, pain is a trial, and death a release. It's hard to imagine that once, knowledge itself could kill. To say the earth revolved around the sun was to sign your own death warrant. To question the church's power was to invite the charge of heresy. That blind faith, guarded by fire and blood, plunged an entire continent into centuries of darkness and fear. People no longer sought truth. They learned only to bow and believe. But don't rush to judge them. For when the world is cloaked in darkness, faith is often the only thing that keeps one standing. In a time without antibiotics, without the light of science, prayer was the only medicine. For the soul, people didn't know why disease spread, so they believed it was sin. They didn't know why comets blazed across the sky, so they saw them as omens. And when someone recovered, it wasn't medicine, it was a miracle. In that ignorance, the church became almighty. It gave people faith to live, yet bound them in invisible chains. Each sermon was not just a teaching, it was a command. Each cross was not only a symbol of mercy, it was a mark of control. And whenever someone dared to question, the fires of the Inquisition were lit again, as a warning that knowledge always carries a price. Yet within those very flames, the seeds of awakening began to sprout. For even when chained by belief, the human spirit still longed to understand. A few brave souls chose the dangerous path. They dared to ask. They dared to say that disease came from germs, not sin, that the earth was not the center of the universe, that mankind could save itself, and for that, they were condemned, tortured, and burned. But their words survived, flickering through the centuries like faint light in humanity's dungeon. Meanwhile, the crowds continued to pray, to believe, and to spill blood for things they did not understand. Because in the chaos of that era, believing wrongly was easier than not believing at all. That is the tragedy of the Middle Ages, a time not short of devotion, but starved of reason amid wounds and prayers. One haunting image remains: the barber with his blade, the priest with his cross, and the patient with eyes full of trust. They did not know that blood could not wash away sin, but the sincerity of their faith gave the age its strange, holy madness, a soul both sacred and deranged. If you are a time traveler, the lesson here is not to avoid churches or barbers, but to understand that faith can save, and faith can kill. You must learn to speak less, bow more, and keep your eyes just a little dull. For in the Middle Ages, being too clever could be a sin, and silence, your best armor. What was most terrifying about the age of blind faith was not the cruelty of the church, but the willingness of people to obey. They were not forced, they believed, they were not threatened, they feared being wrong, and it was that fear of error that plunged the world into a long, unbroken night. A night that would last for centuries, until the light of reason finally returned. But remember this, without night, we would never cherish the sun. The Middle Ages, with its razors and blood, its prayers and pyres, was the shadow humanity needed to learn how to see the light. And within the tolling of church bells through the mist, one might still hear something deeply human, a trembling prayer whispered between blood and belief, not for God, but for the human will to understand. That age taught us that sometimes, I don't know is the wisest answer of all, because in that world, knowing too much meant death. After the fires of execution dimmed and the echoes of prayers faded into darkness, medieval Europe continued to turn quietly within the endless circle of faith and fear. When the blood on the squares had dried and the smoke of the Inquisition had drifted away on the wind, humanity was left with a bitter lesson. In a world where truth burned with those who dared to speak it, survival meant learning how to stay silent, and so people learned to hide, not just their thoughts, but their hearts. Welcome to part 4. Don't dress well, don't speak truth, don't love anyone. 3 brutal survival rules in a world where envy, suspicion, and prejudice were deadlier than any blade. If you think the Middle Ages were frightening because of plagues and wars, you've yet to face the most terrifying thing of all: people. In a place where every eye watched you, where every word could be used as evidence of treason, and every unusual gesture could be deemed sinful, the only true safety was to become invisible. Medieval people didn't just live to survive, they lived to avoid attention. Because attention, whether born of beauty, wit, or love, could lead to ruin. A beautiful girl who caught a lord's eye might be drawn into a game of power and desire she could never win. Man who dressed above his station could be accused of arrogance or witchcraft, and one who spoke the truth, who dared expose injustice, would vanish swiftly into the shadows. Don't dress well. In a world where clothing defined your rank, dressing beyond your class was not merely arrogance, it was a crime. The sumptuary laws dictated every thread on your body. Only nobles could wear velvet, only the titled could wear silk, while commoners were bound to coarse wool and rough linen. If you, a time traveller, arrived in your modern leather jacket, the entire village might suspect you of sorcery. In those days, dressing wrongly could not only bring mockery, it could bring the gallows. Don't speak truth. In the Middle Ages, truth did not belong to reason. It belonged to power. You might see what's wrong. You might know it, but to speak it was suicide. People learned to talk in circles, to bow their heads, or to repeat only what was safe to believe. When the church was the center of the universe, every other truth became heresy. Even a harmless phrase like, "I think the sick should not be bled anymore," could be proof that you were defying God's will. People lived in fear of their own words, and silence became the safest language. But the cruelest rule of all was, don't love anyone. Love, the sacred flame we now celebrate, was the greatest danger in the medieval world. To love the wrong person, to love across class lines, or to love someone already claimed, could cost you everything. A maid who loved a knight, that was not a romance, but a death sentence. A lady who loved a poet, that was a scandal that could end in exile or execution. Even within marriage, love was not the goal. Duty and alliance were. Love was a luxury, an illusion reserved for poets whispering in secret verses. The castles glowed with candlelight, but within them lived souls shackled by arranged unions. Husbands who did not love their wives, wives who did not love their husbands. Yet they smiled at banquets and prayed together because that was the role society demanded. Beyond those walls, those who dared to love truly, across class, against their parents, or by instinct, often met their end in tragedy. Romeo and Juliet was not just a play, it was the breath of that age itself. The Middle Ages were a world of masks. People cloaked themselves in pretense, false humility, false faith, false happiness. Only those who could hide their emotions were considered wise. A misplaced smile could be seen as insolence. A glance held too long could be accused of seduction. Thus, honesty, the purest human quality, became the most dangerous. Imagine yourself, a time traveller, stepping into that world. You smile brightly at strangers, greet them openly, and speak your mind. Within hours, the crowd's eyes turn wary. Within days, whispers spread that you are cursed, possessed, or a witch. Because in a world where truth is forbidden, openness is a sin, and yet within that darkness, there remained something deeply human, the yearning to be oneself. Though crushed and silenced, people still loved, still longed, still wrote secret letters hidden in drawers, still exchanged furtive glances across tables, still dreamed of a day when they could speak freely. Those small rebellions, a forbidden embroidered flower, a hidden poem, a quiet confession, were proof that humanity never truly died. The medieval world taught a cold lesson. To survive did not mean to live rightly. You could escape death, but only by killing the truth within yourself. And that, perhaps, was the greatest tragedy of all, an age where the honest were burned, the loving were punished, and the deceitful were rewarded. Looking back, it's easy to ask, why didn't they rebel? Why didn't they speak out? But if you lived in that world, where one wrong word could doom your entire family, would you dare to love, to speak, to be different? Or would you too bow your head, stay silent, and survive another day? Perhaps that is why the Middle Ages still haunt us. Not for its blood or wars, but for the shadows within the human soul, the fear of being true. If there is one piece of advice for a time traveler, it is this: forget romance, pack away your pride, and keep silent as though your soul depends on it. Because in the Middle Ages, sometimes survival itself was the most beautiful sin, and when you leave that world behind and return to the present, you may notice something unsettling. The rules, don't dress well, don't speak truth, don't love anyone, haven't vanished. They've merely changed shape, subtler, softer, but still whisper through the hidden corners of our modern world. Because sometimes, the Middle Ages never truly ended. They live on in the fears we still carry. And then, when people had learned to bow their heads, to keep silent, and to survive the harsh rules of medieval society, it seemed they had escaped every calamity. But history smiled, a dark, cruel smile. For just when people thought they were wise enough to handle earthly powers, nature rose up, quietly and invisibly. No one was burned, no one tried, but all of Europe knelt before another judgment, the judgment of death. And so began the smell of death, when the pandemic sang the final song. 47. A ship docked in Sicily, carrying goods, a few rats, and the seed of something that would change the world forever. No one guessed that in the tiny bites of the fleas hiding in that grey fur lay humanity's loudest music, the symphony of death. Within months, bustling cities turned into vast graveyards. Church bells never stopped ringing, not to pray, but to count the time between funeral processions. There was no distinction of noble or peasant, priest or thief. All shared the same fate, a hurried grave amid the stench that filled the streets. They called it the Black Death. But that death was more than the end of life. It was the stripping bare of every belief, every order, and every illusion people had clung to. Imagine, you walk down a street that used to be full of cries of vendors, the smell of baked bread, children's laughter. Now there is only the funeral horn, groans, and the wheels of carts rolling by carrying bodies wrapped in tattered cloth. A man follows the cart, his voice hoarse as he cries, "Bring out your dead!" His call is no longer a summons, but a mournful litany, repeated endlessly. Bodies piled upon bodies, churches overflowed, priests fled, physicians died before they could diagnose. People said, "Death moves faster than prayer." The stench of corpses mixed with the scent of candles and incense, a horrific blend that soaked into every brick, every hair, every gust of wind. It was no longer the smell of rot, it was the smell of the end of the world. In that panic, people sought reasons. Some said it was God's punishment. Others blamed Mars or witches or accused Jews of poisoning wells. No one thought of the rat. No one considered that their own filth, fear, and ignorance had opened the door for death to enter. The world then was not only sick, it was infected with false belief. But the cruelest thing was not the number of the dead, but the survivors. They walked through the ashes, having lost family, friends, priests, kings, and even their faith. They had believed God was their saviour, but seeing priests collapsed by the altar, they understood. Perhaps no one was listening to their prayers. Some turned away from religion. Others grew frantic, self-punishing, beating themselves to atone, hoping pain would buy mercy. Across Europe, flagellant processions marched, ragged men whipping themselves until blood flowed, chanting sorrowful songs. They believed that by doing so, they could redeem humanity's sins, but the lashes on their backs did not stop the plague. They only shed more blood on roads already blackened. Ironically, among the corpses, people began to learn what it meant to live. When death is everywhere, at the alley's mouth, on the rooftops, in sleep, you begin to value each breath. People started to drink, to sing, to eat as if tomorrow would never come. Small festivals sprang up amid the ashes. The macabre dance, the dance of death, became the era's new emblem. In that dance, the living and the dead joined hands, dancing among the flames as if mocking fate. Death, in some way, taught people to love life. It forced them to see that all glory, all rank, all laws are meaningless before the final horn. There are stories that when the plague swept Florence, some painters hid in monasteries, trembling amid the smell of remedies and prayers. Yet in that darkness, with death stalking them, they saw something strange: light. From the ashes of the epidemic, the Renaissance was born. For once people realized how fragile life was, they yearned to create permanence. Paintings, poems, statues arose, not to honor death, but to assert, we once lived. Death is fairer than justice, people said, because it came to everyone, king and peasant, priest and thief. In an age when justice was warped by power, death was the one thing that favored no one. But fairness did not mean mercy. Medieval death was not gentle. It came at night, unannounced, with hoarse coughing, black buboes, and a fear that crept through every room. It stole breath and hope, and left silence. A silence the whole world had to learn to accept. If you, a time traveler, accidentally found yourself in 1348, remember, do not breathe deeply. Not because of dirty air, but because the odor of death will cling to your mind forever. You will see streets devoid of life, empty tables, and orphans staring into nothing. You will understand that death not only steals bodies, but robs existence of meaning. Yet in that extremity, something miraculous took root. When everything collapsed, people began to look at each other differently. No more nobles or peasants, no more guilt or sanctity, only people trying to survive. And in that absolute equality of tragedy, humanity was reborn. The Black Death, with all its cruelty, did more than kill. It purified. It forced humanity to face itself and see its smallness before nature. It shattered pride, but it also opened the door to awakening. From it, Europe stepped into a new era, an era that learned to doubt, to ask questions, to seek the light. And when the last of the dead were buried and the stench of the pestilence dissolved into the wind, humanity emerged from the darkness, not triumphant, but with a quiet fear. If we forget this lesson, the final song of death will play again. For history always has a way of singing that tune again, when people grow too confident that they are safe. And so, amid the mournful echoes of the Middle Ages, where the tolling of bells for the dead replaced the sound of songs, where damp alleys and moss-covered walls seemed to swallow the human soul, there were still those who dared to rise, to fight, to challenge fate itself. When the world allowed only men to wield swords, there were women who chose to step into the sand, their hands gripping cold steel, their eyes burning like fire. This is the story of the Gladiatrix, the female warriors of the ancient arena, spirits blazing bright in an age steeped in darkness. They were not princesses dreaming in ivory towers, nor gentle women standing quietly behind kitchen doors. They were beings who traded their lives for the right to exist, to be seen, to be remembered. In a world where honor belonged only to men, every step a gladiatrix took was an act of defiance. When their blades sliced through the air, it wasn't only blood that fell upon the sand. It was the cry of freedom breaking through 1,000 chains. Imagine a Roman afternoon inside the Colosseum. The golden sand burns like fire. The crowd roars the names of their champions. War drums thunder across the air. And through that storm of sound, a small figure steps forward. A woman in leather armor, her hair tied high, her eyes unflinching. Every gaze falls upon her. To them she is mere entertainment, but to her this is destiny, a fragile life standing against the world. A woman warrior, deemed an anomaly by her society, proving that strength belongs not to a gender, but to those who dare to fight. The gladiatrix were not born to battle. They were forced, thrown into the arena as objects of amusement. Yet amid the torment, they turned despair into defiance. They learned to master their weapons, to read the breath of their enemy, to fall with pride unbroken. Each time one of them survived, it was a slap in the face of Roman society, a world that allowed women only to obey. And every victory was a declaration. If I cannot live free, then let me die a legend. Behind those warriors lies an entire story that history tried to erase. People remember Spartacus, the symbol of rebellion, but few recall that amid the dust of the arena, there were also female Spartacus. They faced not only spears and swords, but prejudice, disdain, and the cold gaze of the world. Yet in that crucible of suffering, they left their mark, not in marble statues, but in blood, sweat, and screams that still echo louder than any hymn. Perhaps when we look back at that era, we glimpse a painful paradox. Women were bound in every aspect of life, yet in the cruelest places, the arena, the battlefield, or the shadow of power, they shone the brightest, for it is only when driven to the edge that the human instinct to survive and the yearning for freedom reveal their truest form. The Gladiatrix stand as living proof of pride, of unyielding will, of the spirit that refuses to kneel before injustice. And perhaps most ironic of all, when men in the stands roared as each woman fell, they never realized that the very woman they scorned lived with more courage than any among them. She was no longer a slave, nor a spectacle, but a symbol of rebirth, of the boundless power to fight back. For within the drumbeats and the blood-stained sand, a quiet truth rose up. History is not written only by pens, but by the blood of those forgotten. Today, when we speak of feminism, we think of slogans, of movements, of speeches. But more than 2,000 years ago, there were women who raised their voices not with words, but with deeds, with blood and tears. They were the first to proclaim, to live is to choose is to be free. And though their names were erased from history, their spirits still live on, echoing through the memory of humankind. The tale of the Gladiatrix is not merely one of physical strength. It is a hymn to human pride, to the ability to rise, even when the world demands your fall. When we look at them, we see not only the past, but also ourselves, modern souls still fighting daily in our own arenas, of society, of fear, of limitation, and of belief. And perhaps what makes the Gladiatrix immortal is not their victories, but their refusal to yield. Amid the roar of the crowd and the haze of dust, they chose to lift their heads, to meet fate's gaze, and to smile, a smile both beautiful and tragic, both sorrowful and free. Because in every age, freedom comes at a price, and there are those who, even if they burn only for a fleeting moment, shine so brightly that the world must bow before their spirit. It is they, the nameless Gladiatrix, who taught humanity its greatest truth. That greatness lies not in winning, but in the courage to fight, even when you know you will fall. After the final drum of the arena faded, and the dust settled over the bloodstains of the fallen warrior women, the world seemed to return to its old order, where men sat upon thrones, and women were pushed into the shadows. But silence has never meant an ending, for it was only after the gladiatrices fell that fear truly began to seep into the heart of the Roman Empire. Not fear of enemies at the borders, nor of war or poverty, but fear of beauty, of femininity, of the soft power wielded by the very women they had once despised. And that is where our story turns a new page. When Rome trembled, beauty, blood, and the ban. There is a strange paradox in history. Every great empire has trembled before its own reflection of beauty. For Rome, that beauty bore the face of women, creatures both enchanting and dangerous, both desired and uncontrollable. After the age of gladiators, Rome transformed, from iron to indulgence, from swords to perfumes, from the battlefield to the palace. Yet the more splendid it became, the more fragile it was. Amid the banquets of wine and the music of lyres, emperors began to realize that what could topple a throne was not the sword, but the gaze of a woman who knew her power. In Rome, beauty was a weapon so dangerous that it had to be forbidden. concealed, even burned. For the more men fell to seduction, the weaker power became. Beautiful women were soon branded as the ruin of empires, as the ghosts haunting the throne. Laws were written, forbidding excessive makeup, banning fine silk, denying women any step into politics. But the more they forbade, the more beauty defied them, until Rome, staring into its mirror, saw not glory, but its own fear staring back. Picture an evening in a Roman palace. The glow of 100 torches glistens on the pale skin of a noblewoman, drawing every gaze toward her. In her eyes lies not just shyness, but a calm intelligence, the very thing that the powerful dread most. They fear that one smile might sway a decision, that a single tear might cast an empire into chaos. And so Rome, the symbol of reason and might, declared war upon its own women. But in that war, who truly won? Perhaps no one. For as men tightened the chains upon women's bodies and souls, they themselves were imprisoned within their own insecurity. They forbade, they preached, they drafted moral codes to hide their fear. They did not understand that beauty cannot be killed. It merely transforms. It becomes wit, influence, the quiet allure hidden in words and glances. Thus, the women of Rome learned to fight differently. No longer with swords or in arenas, they wielded intellect and grace as their armor. They entered palaces not with blades, but with words sharp enough to draw blood. They became advisors, lovers, the unseen hands behind the throne. They needed no place in the history books. It was enough to make history remember them. Stories like those of Messalina, Agrippina and Cleopatra, though she was Queen of Egypt, she made even Rome kneel, became emblems of the era. They were called dangerous, deceptive, bewitching, yet look closely, and you'll see these were the words of frightened men writing history. They feared the intellect that could unmake their certainty, the gaze that could make them doubt themselves. And so, the strongest women became monsters of legend, not because they were evil, but because they dared to be free. In the hands of a Roman woman, beauty was a double-edged flame. It could illuminate or consume. It could raise her to the heights of power or burn her in the fires of male suspicion. Some died gloriously, others quietly, but all carried the same spark, the yearning to be themselves. Pause for a moment and ask, why did Rome, conqueror of the world, tremble before a smile? Perhaps because it knew there is no power greater than the ability to inspire trust, to evoke love, to make others surrender willingly. And that power belongs only to beauty, when it walks hand in hand with intelligence. Yet as the empire aged, what was once celebrated became forbidden. Beauty turned to sin, love became crime, and women, once the soul of Roman culture, were erased from the light. That was the beginning of decline. For every civilization that turns its back on life, on beauty, on freedom, signs its own death sentence. And so, while Rome still feasted in splendor, while emperors still believed themselves the center of the universe, somewhere, quietly, women kept the final breath of that fading world alive, through letters, through poems, through silent glances across the dark. They told the story of an empire that fell not to war, but to its own fear of tenderness, and perhaps that is the reminder for us today. All power, no matter how mighty, will tremble before beauty, when that beauty is free, thoughtful, and capable of love. For beauty, by its nature, is never a sin. It becomes a danger only when those in power forget this truth. What makes humanity most formidable is not the face, but the soul that lies within. For when Rome trembled, it was not merely women it feared its own humanity, its softness, its compassion, its longing to live authentically. And the moment humankind begins to fear itself, that is when civilization starts to count its final days. When the Roman Empire began to fear its own women, when the authority of men trembled before the gaze of beauty, in the distant east, where the Nile drifted lazily between golden banks of desert, another woman was turning that very fear into art, and that art into a weapon. If Rome sought to imprison beauty, she made it her throne. If Rome feared women who wielded swords, she lifted a goblet instead and conquered empires. Her name was Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, the woman who turned banquets into battlefields and seduction into politics. This is not merely the tale of a beautiful woman, but the legend of one who understood that true power lies not in the sword, but in the ability to make an enemy kneel with a smile. Cleopatra. Her name rings like a melody, both intoxicating and perilous. In history, she has been painted in two conflicting shades: a wanton schemer in the eyes of her conquerors, and a symbol of intellect and refined statecraft in the eyes of those who looked deeper. For in an age ruled by men, Cleopatra understood that to survive, a woman could not simply be a woman. She had to become the stage, the script, and the actress all at once. Every meal under Cleopatra's reign was not a feast, but a performance of power. In chambers gilded with gold dust and perfumed with myrrh, she appeared like a goddess born of light itself. Food was an offering, wine an invitation, and every glance, every movement, every word, a calculated strike. Caesar had conquered legions, yet was conquered by the way she raised a cup. Antony, who once laughed on the battlefield, trembled at her smile. Cleopatra did not command. She made others want to obey. To her, power was a performance. She ruled not with iron, but with strategic allure. She never needed to shout to be heard, because when she spoke, the world fell silent. When she dissolved a pearl in vinegar and drank it, it was not madness nor vanity, but a declaration. I do not wear the crown. I swallow it. In one gesture, she transformed the symbol of material power into a triumph of spirit. Before the stunned eyes of the mighty, Cleopatra redefined what it meant to rule. Yet behind the incense and lotus blossoms lay a mind as sharp as obsidian. Cleopatra knew a queen could not afford to love as an ordinary woman. Her loves, for Caesar, for Antony, were not mere passions, but moves in a grand political game. She loved with intellect, with ambition, with the fierce will to keep Egypt free from Rome's grasp. Each kiss, each whisper was an unwritten treaty. And when history condemned her as a woman who used seduction for power, we forget, in a world where men waged wars to claim territory, Cleopatra used only herself and lost to no one. Her allure was never about beauty alone. It was about presence. Ancient records tell us she was not conventionally beautiful, yet when she entered a room, it changed. No one could look away. No one could fail to listen. That power came from intellect, the kind that gave beauty depth and made those around her feel they stood before not just a woman, but a civilization incarnate. Cleopatra was Egypt, and Egypt was her. Both carried the same mystique, ancient, luminous, and perilous. Under her rule, Alexandria became the heart of knowledge and art. Poets, scholars, and philosophers from across the world gathered there, drawn by a ruler who was not only a queen, but a lover of wisdom itself. But like all great tragedies, her brilliance burned too brightly for the world to bear. Rome, the empire that once feared the beauty of its own women, now trembled before the radiance of an Eastern queen. She was the mirror reflecting Rome's deepest terror, that a woman could be beautiful, intelligent, and powerful all at once. And when that fear grew unbearable, they called her a menace, a witch, the temptation of the world. Yet Cleopatra never asked history for permission to exist. She wrote her name into it herself, in pearls, in wine, and in the blood of those who underestimated her. Every banquet she held was not indulgence, but assertion that women, too, could shape politics through art, emotion, and intellect. She understood that in a man's world, there were only two ways to be remembered: to submit or to make yourself unforgettable. Cleopatra chose the latter. And so, amid the incense of Egypt, the murmur of the Nile, and the song of the harp, she forged a legend, not merely of beauty, but of defiance. for Cleopatra was more than a beautiful woman. She was the embodiment of agency itself, the will to love, to live, to define one's own name. Looking back, the journey from Rome to Egypt was more than the passage between two civilizations. It was the migration of feminine power, from suppression to presence, from silence to sovereignty. Women were no longer shadows in the court. They became the pulse that shaped history itself. And Cleopatra, with her proud gaze in the empire of men, proved that. If the world is a banquet, women were never born to be the feast. They were born to sit at the head of the table, in every goblet of wine, every flicker of oil lamp, every burst of laughter in the night. We can still hear the echo of an age when power no longer bore the face of war, but of a smiling woman. Cleopatra made history drink with her, not because it wished to, but because it could not refuse. And that is what made her a legend. A woman who knew that true power does not come from commanding, but from making the whole world choose to bow. And then, like every legend that once burned bright, Cleopatra's light too eventually had to face the dusk. After the gilded banquets, after winning the hearts and minds of two empires, she knew no feast lasts forever. When Rome surged into Alexandria, when warships blazed on the Nile, Cleopatra's world, brilliant, lavish, and cunning, began to dissolve into ash and dust. Yet even as defeat knocked at her door, she would not let others write her final chapter. For a true queen does not fear death. She fears only being forgotten. And so our story turns to its final chapter, the last banquet, when death must bow. That room, where the oil lamps fluttered among myrrh smoke and sandalwood, was no longer a palace but a stage for the greatest performance of her life. Cleopatra, in a gown white as moonlight, sat before a wall inlaid with lapis and gold. Before her lay a table, not for guests, but for death. The wine deep crimson like blood, lotus petals scattered across the floor. And in a corner, a basket of figs where a serpent lay coiled, silently waiting. They say that in her final moment, Cleopatra did not cry. She only smiled, for she understood. Death was not defeat, but a way to reclaim mastery over herself. When all power, victory, and fame had been stripped by Rome, she chose the one thing they could not touch, the right to choose how to leave. That last banquet was not merely suicide, but a declaration. In a world where men proved their existence through war, Cleopatra used death to prove her being. When Antony had fallen and Alexandria burned, she did not plead or beg. She prepared as if to welcome an honored guest, death itself. Imagine the scene, the soft sound of a lyre, sweet incense mingling with the breath of wine, and the queen raising the cup as she had done 1,000 times before. But this time the cup was not for lovers or enemies. It was for destiny. In her calm gaze, there was the pride of someone who understood. If she could not live as a queen, then she must at least die as an emblem. Cleopatra did not take her life out of despair. She died to keep herself intact. If Rome captured her alive, she would be paraded as spoils, mocked through the streets like a puppet. But Cleopatra was not born to be looked down upon. She was born to make the world look up. And so, in that final instant, she made death into an honoring rite. From the moment the serpent bit her wrist, the legend was born. No longer merely the Queen of Egypt, she became immortal in human memory. Cleopatra's death was a symphony of tragedy and triumph, of ending and rebirth. They say that even after her breath ceased, the fragrance lingered in the room, as if her soul remained there, smiling at the world's astonishment. And strangely, the more centuries passed, the more that smile shone. Because Cleopatra did not die in darkness, she died in the light of herself. She was not forgotten in suffering. She was remembered in proud beauty. Her departure resembled an ancient rite. Life offered to beauty, to freedom, to the right to master one's fate. People have argued for thousands of years over whether the serpent was real and why she chose death. But those questions no longer matter. For whatever the truth, Cleopatra made rumor itself serve her legend. And that was her genius, turning even the ending into a tale that humanity could not stop telling. In the world of power and blood, where men died to carve their names into stone, Cleopatra engraved hers with pearls, tears, and will. She taught history a cruel lesson. Death is only defeat for those who never truly lived. To one who has lived fully, Dying is merely another way to continue shining. The image of the queen lying among lotus petals, beneath oil lamps and the soft lapping of Nile waves, remains one of humanity's most beautiful tragedies. It is not a scene of cessation, but a moment when beauty bests power. Rome may have taken Egypt, but it could never possess Cleopatra. And perhaps, in that very moment, death too had to bow. Not out of fear, but out of reverence, for it recognized that the woman before it did not die like a vanquished foe. She departed like a goddess. From then on, Cleopatra became more than a name. She became a symbol of the desire to master one's fate, of the soul's freedom, of beauty that defines itself. She proved that sometimes the way we end is what makes the world remember us. If Gladiatrix is the story of women who fought with blood, if When Rome Trembled is the tale of women who fought with beauty, then Cleopatra is the summit of both. A woman who fought with intellect, with art, and finally with death. Cleopatra's death does not close a chapter. It opens a new one in the human imagination. After her, no one could again claim that women must stand only behind power. She showed the world that when women hold the art of living and dying in their hands, they are power, and so, through the millennia, even as the Nile flows and Alexandria lies in ruins, whenever Cleopatra's name is spoken, people do not speak of defeat or lost dominion. They speak of a smile that made even death bow. And then, after the stone door closed, after Cleopatra's final breath dissolved into the night mist over the Nile, the world seemed to pause for a heartbeat. The beauty that had once conquered Rome now remained only in legend, like moonlight reflected upon the river's surface, fading, softening, but never entirely gone. And in that stillness, between death and rebirth, humankind began to lift its gaze toward the heavens, seeking something beyond blood, power, and flesh. They turned to the divine, to symbols transcending beauty, longing, and faith. And so, the story leads us to another realm, where the moon of Yria shines, where the line between goddess and mortal grows faint. Part 10. Under the moon of Yria, when goddess and human are one. On a small island adrift in the Aegean Sea, night descends like a silver veil, and the full moon pours its light over the ancient temples of Yria, where the Greeks once believed the gods still walked among mortals. No war, no blood remained, only the whisper of waves and the scent of resin carried by the sea wind through palm groves. In that place, people did not look upon the gods with fear, but with love. Love for what is beautiful, fragile, and eternal. Yria was not a single deity. She was a symbol, the fusion of all that is sacred and earthly. Beneath her moonlight, every boundary dissolved. Goddess and human, love and death, purity and desire, all intermingled, blending into one gentle symphony. It is said that on moonlit nights, maidens would submerge themselves in the water, believing the spirit of Yria would touch them. And in that instant, they would become immortal, not in body, but in soul. At that time, the Greek world was no longer a land of conquest or bloodthirsty kings. It became a landscape of memory, where humankind learned to rediscover itself through beauty. Beauty was no longer measured by force or power, but by harmony between man and the cosmos. And Yria, in the consciousness of the ancients, was the moon itself. A light that illuminates but never possesses, that exists without needing to be touched. Throughout human culture, the moon has always been a symbol of the unattainable, something that stirs both desire and fear. But under Yria's moonlight, fear dissolved, leaving only communion, as mankind accepted its smallness, yet realized it carried within a fragment of the divine. Perhaps that is what made ancient Greece eternal. They did not build temples only to worship, but to reflect their own souls. When artisans carved statues of gods, they did not seek to recreate a supernatural being, but to reveal the sacred within themselves. That is why every curve, every gaze frozen in marble carries a belief that we are not separate from the divine, but only the part of it that still dreams. Under Yria's moon, everything became hazy, yet achingly beautiful. People believed that when the moonlight touched the sea, the spirits of ancient goddesses returned, not to judge, but to remind humanity that true beauty lies not in power, but in the capacity to love and be loved. In that night, those who stood by the shore might glimpse faint silhouettes, the shades of women once immortalized in stone, now reborn in the form of wind and wave. They were no longer Cleopatra, no longer the Gladiatrix, but the embodiment of the same eternal soul. The soul of women who knew how to love, to live, and to die for beauty. Yria, that moonlight, shone not only upon temples, but into the hearts of modern men. For though the world has changed, war, wealth, and ambition still lead us astray. Yet each time we lift our eyes to the moon, for one brief moment, we rediscover the Yria that sleeps within us. The part that still feels, still understands, still bows before the beauty of life. And just as Cleopatra once turned death into ritual, the ancient Greeks transformed moonlight into the ritual of life. They did not beg the gods for mercy. They invited them to sit, to drink, to dance together through the night. The sacred was not distant. It lived in laughter, in wine, in the beating of human hearts. It was the perfect union, when goddess and mortal were one. Perhaps that is the greatest secret history has ever tried to hide. That the most sacred things are not above us, but within us. When we pause to listen to the wind, to gaze at the moon, to feel the breath of the sea, we are not merely living, but conversing with the divine. And if Cleopatra once made death bow its head, then Yria made the universe fall silent. For she did not fight, she did not conquer, she simply shone. Her light was not loud like triumph, nor dazzling like a throne, but steady and enduring, like the rhythm of the moon gliding through centuries. Today, amid the clamour of modern life, we still find ourselves beneath that same moonlight. For sometimes what we need is not victory or power, but a single quiet moment to look inward, to remember that we once carried, and still carry, the soul of Yria. As the moon drifts silently across the sky, the world is cleansed once more. No more tragedy, no more blood, only the light and stillness of souls that have found themselves. And perhaps that is the final message of this entire tale, that after all wars, all glories, and all losses, the one thing that grants humanity immortality is the ability to merge with the universe, to live, to love, and to dissolve into moonlight like Yria. And so, our journey through time comes to a close. From the muddy streets of medieval Europe, to the blazing arenas of Rome, to the ethereal moonlight over distant Yria, every step reminds us that history is never merely the past, but a mirror reflecting who we are today. For across centuries, humanity has never changed at its core. Still afraid, still yearning, still searching for meaning in the shadow of time. And if one day you truly had the chance to step into the Middle Ages, remember this: bring not only your knowledge, but also your curiosity and a touch of humility, because that world was never kind to the weak, yet it always opened its arms to those who dared to observe and understand. But if you remain here, in the heart of the 21st century, then let the journey continue. Hit subscribe and like, and together we'll unlock countless more doors of time, to wander through forgotten lands and listen to the whispers of the past echo softly within the dreams of today.